In the first days of November 1941, after the heavy and prolonged battles for Uritsk, the remnants of our battalion were pulled out of the fighting. Now we were seeing Leningrad, how the beautiful city had been transformed, how it had changed in the 4.5 months of the war. Barricades blocked the streets. Deep trenches had been dug into the gardens and parks. Long gun barrels poked around previously peaceful corners. People in civilian dress were marching around with rifles in their hands, learning to fight. Shop windows had been nailed over with boards. The street lamps had been extinguished. The city was in darkness. The muffled sound of airplane engines was in the air. Anti-aircraft shells streaked into the sky and exploded in bursts of golden light. Shell fragments rattled on the rooftops. Observing the stern beauty of a front-line night, I strained to look into the distance around me and saw a wounded city plunged into darkness, but also a living and proud Leningrad. The 3 days of rest flashed past. Our battalion was disbanded, and I was sent to the 21st NKVD Rifle Division. Happily, here I ran into some old comrades from Chistyakov's battalion and Kruglov's company. A new stage in the war began: trench warfare. The command of Army Group North decided to besiege Leningrad and wait for it to die. Things were tough for us too. It required a lot of blood and lives to stop the fascists, who were armed to the teeth with first-class equipment and still intoxicated by their successes, and force them to dig in to the earth. We snipers weren't held long in the headquarters of the 14th Regiment. Ulyanov and I were ordered to join the 1st Battalion, which was occupying a sector of the defence in front of Uritsk. Along the road to the battalion, we bumped into our old friend, machine gunner Vasily Yershov. Uncle Vasya rejoiced at the meeting. "Where is the road taking you, fellows?" "We're going to the 1st Battalion, Uncle Vasya, and once there, to wherever we're ordered." "Where else but to Kruglov's company? He, brother, has been pestering the battalion. Give me back my snipers, and I won't say a word more, but we don't have enough work for you, friends." Yershov placed the zinc cartridge case on the ground. "Truly, the Germans in the winter aren't like those in the summer. They've become quiet fellows, but it happens sometimes a drunken voice will call out to our side, 'Russ, give up, you're surrounded and starving.'" We had a smoke. We recalled our combat friends and comrades who were no longer with us. In parting, Uncle Vasya warned us, "Look sharp, guys, and take care of yourselves. The German marksmen also don't miss. They shoot to kill. And indeed, they know how to conceal themselves well." We continued on our way. They didn't hold us long at battalion headquarters either. The Chief of Staff, smiling, handed Ulyanov a note and said, "I have to suppose that you'll find the road to Kruglov's company. The area is familiar to you." Ulyanov left immediately. Kruglov's company was holding the battalion's most difficult sector of defence. They hadn't managed to dig communication trenches. In order to reach any platoon, you had to creep across open ground, and indeed only at night. Sergeant Major Kapustin greeted us. I knew him. He was a capable manager and a good comrade. The soldiers jokingly called him our night owl. Kapustin preferred to perform his duties as sergeant major at night. Several days passed. I was lying on an upper bunk when Senior Lieutenant Kruglov stepped into the bunker. "Greetings, fellows!" The commander was suffering from a heavy cold. His voice was hoarse and he was coughing heavily. His eyes were reddened and seemed angry. Kapustin began to report on company matters. I watched the commander carefully. Things had been grim lately. The Politruk had been wounded and they hadn't yet sent a replacement. The day before, during a mortar barrage, the sniper Nazarchuk had been killed, and 3 other men had been wounded. Kruglov was silent. Loudly crackling, some brushwood was burning in the iron stove. Kapustin broke the silence. 2 snipers, Ulyanov and Pilyushin, have been sent to the company, and a little earlier, the female sniper Zina Stroyeva. She knows you. I sent her to Nestorov's 2nd platoon. The wrinkles on Kruglov's forehead relaxed. Kapustin continued. On the sector of Olkov's platoon, Enemy leaflets have begun to appear recently. Some swine must have infiltrated our ranks with the last batch of replacements. The commander sharply raised his head. "Have you taken measures to find the sneak?" he dryly asked. "No, we were waiting for you." "And you haven't reported this to anyone?" "No, not to anyone." "Such cases must be reported immediately, but send Pilyushin to Olkov's platoon." With that, Kruglov picked up his submachine gun and stepped out into the trench. My drowsiness had vanished. I hopped down, tightened the belt around my cotton jacket, and set out for Olkov's platoon, where Alexei Ulyanov had been sent at the order from the sergeant major 3 days before. I found Ulyanov in one of the first squad's bunkers. He was hunkered down by a metal stove and stirring some kasha in a pot with a spoon. An unfamiliar sergeant was seated on an empty cartridge box next to Ulyanov. They had been discussing something. My entry interrupted their conversation. "The Night Owl has sent you to this platoon as well. That's great." Ulyanov rejoiced to see me. Then he introduced me to the squad commander, Sergeant Andreev, a fellow Leningrader who had already been decorated with 2 orders. Ulyanov proposed that at dawn I take a shift to keep an eye on the Germans. I asked him to come out into the trench with me. There I told him that a traitor or an enemy scout was operating within our platoon sector. Ulyanov heard me out and then said, "Here's something else to ponder. Various people are walking around here. You know, they received me in Olkov's platoon like a brother. But one messenger said spitefully, 'We were expecting 20 and you've arrived alone.' Well, what of it? As the saying goes, a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush." I remained silent, but the platoon's assistant commander Nikolaev seemed to be seething. The messenger continued, "You've come to boost our defences, just when the same thing repeats itself day after day. We have few men, and are forced to stand in the trench for days on end without any rest, while the Germans live so much better than our guys do. They stand at their posts, I've heard, for only 2 hours a day, and they bring them 3-course meals." I told him, "I don't know where you're getting all this information. According to you, the Germans in their trenches and bunkers are living just like in a hotel." The messenger snapped back, "Who do you think I am? A provocateur, perhaps? I'm fighting side by side with you. I'm only saying what I've heard from prisoners." But Nikolaev answered him, "That was at the start of the war. You should take a better look at the Fritzes now. You saw the prisoners recently. One was wrapped in so many rags over his uniform that we wore ourselves out trying to peel them off of him. What didn't he have on him? Women's scarves, pieces of quilts, and over his thighs, the son of a bitch, he'd managed to pull a sheepskin sleeve. And you're babbling about their comfort, some hotel, and 3-course meals." Nikolaev even spat. But the runner, just like nothing had happened, looked around at everyone and then turned to me. "There you see, sniper, how we live. Arguments every day. There are few of us left, we're exhausted, and they aren't sending replacements." I didn't answer him. The orderly stomped around the stove, had a smoke, and went out into the trench. I haven't seen him since. Ulyanov finished his tale. "Do you think he—" I didn't finish my question. "I don't think so," Alexei interrupted me. "I was about to tip off Andreev about this conversation, but he says that he has served together with him and really knows the messenger." Ulyanov and I spent all day preparing materials for our sniper hole, which we had to rebuild in the railroad embankment. With the sun set, we donned camouflage suits and crawled towards the embankment. A north wind was blowing. Sleet painfully lashed my face. The enemy trenches were quite close. In order to leave no trace of our work in the snow, we carried away the dirt in bags back to the trench and spread it out on a ruined segment that had been smashed by a shell. From the machine gunner's bunker, the sound of a guitar playing carried to us. One of the guys was singing. Ulyanov laid his spade on the breastwork, wiped the sweat from his forehead with a sleeve, and stood motionlessly for a minute, listening to the singing. He sings with real feeling. Our work was nearing its end when Sergeant Andreev crawled up to us with a light machine gun. It was apparent that he was agitated about something. He quickly told us, "Guys, Nikolaev is searching for you. He dropped by our bunker several times and asked, 'Where have our snipers gone?' I told him that I didn't know. When he went back out into the trench, I followed him unnoticed. He went around all the firing positions and bunkers, searching for you." "Perhaps the platoon commander has ordered him?" Ulyanov asked. "Absolutely not. I saw Olkov, and he wasn't asking about you. Something else is going on." We were silent a bit. Then Lesha, diminutive nickname of Alexei, blurted out, "I'm even suspicious about a crow now. Perhaps she's scattering the leaflets." Someone opened the door of the machine gunner's bunker back in the trench. The sounds of the guitar again spilled out of the bunker into the snowy landscape. "Our machine gunners are fine singers," the sergeant interrupted the silence. "They're Ukrainians and really love to sing." Ulyanov replied, "Just who doesn't love to sing?" Then, deeply sighing, he picked up the spade again. Andreev took a seat on the bottom of the future sniper pit and, concealing the burning cigarette with his hands, smoked. Tossing away the butt, he rose. "Well, fellows, I'll stay out of your way. I'm going." The sergeant grabbed the machine gun, released the safety, and crawled back to the trench. A few minutes later, we heard Andreev's machine gun begin to work. "A fine fellow," Ulyanov said, listening to the chattering machine gun. Andreev and I finished our work just before dawn, and we slipped back into our trench. We went back to our bunker and had just picked up our spoons when suddenly Nikolaev ran in, out of breath. In his hands he was holding a German leaflet. "Brothers, more leaflets. Listen to what they've written. A pass for Russians. We, Germans, guarantee safety and freedom to Russian soldiers and commanders who wish voluntarily to come over to us. They will be given the possibility to return home and live together with their families and dear ones." Andreev stuck his hands into his pockets, walked up to the assistant platoon commander, and shifting on his feet from side to side, asked, "Why are you reading this shit? We know how the fascists guarantee safety and freedom. Someone is scattering these leaflets, and you're reading them." I watched as Nikolaev's face instantly went pale, and his sharply chiselled chin slightly began to quiver. The assistant platoon commander thrust the leaflet into the burning stove and, stepping out of the bunker, cried, "Mind your own business, Sergeant Andreev." Andreev silently stretched out on a plank bed, propping himself up on the hard mattress on his elbows. The sergeant's eyes watched the narrow ribbon of flame, which was flickering in a tin can, licking at its oily rim. In the semi-darkness of the bunker, his swarthy, coarse face looked focused and thoughtful. It began to grow light. "Time to get to work," Alexei said. Together, Ulyanov and I went out into the trench. The frosty dawn sky was particularly beautiful. Stars still twinkled as it began to become light in the east. We crawled out to our sniper pit. Just 100 meters separated us from the German trench. After a few minutes, Ulyanov tugged my sleeve and handed me the periscope, saying, "Osip, editor's note, variant of Yosef. Take a look at that Fritz over there, crouching behind a tank track. That's very strange. The Nazi was wearing a camouflage cape. Only his face, reddened by the frost, was visible. Several times in a row he flashed a torch on and off and was looking intently in the direction of our defences. We looked back over the line of our platoon with great thoroughness, but didn't see a single person, though the German continued to flash a signal. Ulyanov took aim and fired at the fascist. The torch went out. After the first few shots from our lair, we could hear some hasty footsteps. I quickly crawled back to the trench to meet the approaching person, while Ulyanov remained behind. As soon as I dropped into the trench, the platoon commander's messenger came running up to me, loudly shouting, "Who's shooting?" "What's it to you?" I asked. The assistant commander ordered me to find out and report back to him. "Tell him that we only put out one torch." I returned to our sniper's nest and we continued to scan the German trenches. Then suddenly 3 Nazis stepped out of the ruins of one of Ligovo Station's brick buildings. They were also wearing camouflage suits. 2 of them were carrying kettles suspended from a long pole, while the third was wearing a backpack and holding a bundle of sausage and a bottle. "Do you see?" Ulyanov asked me. "They're carrying breakfast. Steam is still rising from the kettles. Shall we add something sweet to their breakfast?" Alexei fired at the German walking at the rear, and his target fell to his knees and collapsed to the ground. I managed to shoot a second German, but the third dropped into the snow and disappeared from view. When we returned to our bunker, our comrades congratulated us on our first success. After midnight that night, Vasily Yershov dropped by to see us. "Uncle Vasya," Ulyanov exclaimed, "what fates have brought you to us?" "We share the same fate, Lesha," the machine gunner answered, smiling as he warmed his hands at the stove. "We both serve. We go wherever we are ordered. Say, I was just with the company commander, and on my way back I glanced in on you at Zina's request. She instructed me to find out where and how you set up your sniper's nest here, which allowed you to pick off the Fritzes so cleverly." "Zina's returned," Ulyanov exclaimed. "Which platoon is she in?" "In our platoon." We treated our friend to as much food as we could offer. I gave him my vodka ration. Lesha crumbled his ration of tallow onto the lid of the kettle and lit it. We drank the tea without hurry, again reminiscing about our friends to our heart's content. "Uncle Vasya, have you received a letter from home?" I asked. "Somehow I got one. I'm no longer troubled about my family. They're not at the front, they'll live. My wife is a tenacious lady. She's taking care of the kids, or those still with her. But my eldest son is at the front, fighting somewhere. I'm waiting for a letter from him." Yershov lapsed into silence. I regretted that my curiosity had touched a painful spot in him. I knew full well that Yershov wasn't the type to succumb to his inner sufferings for very long, but this time Vasily Dmitrievich was melancholy. He tipped his head onto his left shoulder and, it seemed, was listening to the beat of his own heart. Without changing position, he fell asleep. Before sunrise, we had breakfast with Uncle Vasya. Then Ulyanov and Andreev went out into the trench while I lingered in the bunker with Yershov for some time. "Well, show me where your nest is. I've got to get going back to my platoon," said Uncle Vasya. The night was cold and icy. A north wind was blowing. The darkness, as if unwillingly, was yielding its place to the elusive light of the coming dawn. We entered the sniper's nest and froze in shock. On the ground, with his arms outspread, Ulyanov lay in a pool of blood. I rushed to him. His heart had stopped. He was dead. Uncle Vasya picked up Lesha's fur cap and, squeezing it in his large palms, moaned, "Ah, Lesha, friend, how did this happen, huh?" Tears glistened in Yershov's eyes, and there was a catch in his voice. I quickly went to the embrasure. There were no holes in the armoured shield. Yershov handed me an empty shell casing from a submachine gun. His hands were shaking. He raised the cap to catch the light and called me over. "The matter's clear. Alexei was shot from behind. Look at his cap." I wanted to take the body of my friend into my arms, but Yershov stopped me. "Don't move Alexei from his spot. Let's go." We hadn't even passed 2 turns in the trench when we saw Andreev running to meet us. "Where's Alexei?" asked the sergeant, choking with agitation. "Ulyanov is no more," the machine gunner replied in a shaking voice. I couldn't say a single word. My throat was tight, and it had become difficult to breathe. Andreev rocked back, as if struck by a knife, and leaning with his back against the wall of the trench, shouted, "Lesha! Buddy, I'm guilty for everything!" The sergeant quietly motioned with his hand towards no man's land. I saw a man in a camouflage cape lying on the snow. His left leg was bent at the knee, while his right leg was straight. It seemed to me that we were silent for a long time. I looked at Andreev. He was distraught. Tears flowed down his pale face. "Who is that? How did all this happen?" Yershov finally asked. Anatoly wiped his face with his hand, and in a halting voice told us, Alexei left for the sniper's nest, while I stayed behind with the machine gunners to have a smoke. After a short time, we heard a shot. I thought that it was Ulyanov shooting, but when I went out into the trench, I saw a man crawling back from the sniper's nest. He was crawling quickly, glancing all around. I thought that Lesha had spotted something important and was hurrying back to inform us. I clambered out of the trench to run and meet him, but he had vanished. I headed towards where I last saw him, when suddenly the man I had taken for Ulyanov appeared about 30 meters away from me and fired at me with a pistol, but missed. The bullet hit my sleeve. I ran back to the trench. "Did you see his face?" I asked. "No, it was covered with camouflage netting. I began to wait for him to reappear. At this time I heard a rifle shot from somewhere else in our position. In order to find out what was going on, I ran over to the machine gunners. There I learned that someone had tried to cross no man's land, but he had been killed. That's all I know." I hurried to a telephone in order to inform Kruglov about what had happened, but I hadn't managed to leave the trench when enemy mortar rounds started to fall on us. "Do you see what they're up to?" Yershov said. "They're trying to keep our heads down with the mortar fire while they recover the body. No, we won't give up that creature to them so simply." From the enemy's side, heavy and light machine guns began to chatter. An intense firefight flared up. When everything had quieted down, fresh German corpses were visible beside the body of the fugitive. "That's better," said Uncle Vasya, pulling a tobacco pouch out of the inside pocket of his quilted jacket. "The time has passed when you could parade around the front in columns." We started smoking. We were all uneasy inside. All the comrades were gloomily standing in their positions. Once it was completely light, Kruglov arrived with an unfamiliar lieutenant. The commander was pale. Kruglov didn't say a word about Ulyanov's fate, but it was clear that this death had shaken him. Olkov was sitting at a table with his head lowered, his fingers now and then fingering a flap on his greatcoat. His assistant platoon commander Nikolaev was nowhere to be seen. Once darkness fell, we brought in Ulyanov's body and carried it to the rear, where we buried him with full military honours. After the service, Kruglov asked Yershov and me to take him to the place where the fugitive had exited the trench. One of our soldiers was firing on the German front line in short bursts from a light machine gun. It was Sergeant Andreev. Approaching him, Kruglov laid a hand on his shoulder. "It's dark, Comrade Commander, and hard to see, but I keep firing on the spot where he's laying. Comrade Senior Lieutenant," Andreev continued, "permit me to drag him into our trench. After all, I'm guilty for Alexei's death. We'll get to the bottom of this, but how do you plan to bring in his body? In my opinion, it's better not to wait for deep night. I'll crawl up to him in a minute and carry him off. Fine. Only not alone, and not a word about this to anyone." Kruglov took the machine gun from Andreev's hands and then ordered us to don camouflage cloaks and come back quickly. When we returned, the company commander said, "I'm assigning an important job to you. Andreev and Yershov will go lead, while you—" He turned to me. "Stop not far from where the body is laying and keep watch from that position. It's possible that the Germans will make an attempt for it. Do only what Yershov tells you to do. I'll direct covering fire from here if you need it." Yershov and Andreev jumped over the breastwork and quickly crawled away. I checked my submachine gun, made certain that I had grenades, and then set out in the wake of my comrades. I crawled quickly, scraping my hands on the icy crust on the snow. I strained my eyes to see through the darkness, but nothing was visible beyond 5 paces. I knew that the enemy maintained close watch over no man's land, and if they spotted us or heard our movements, we wouldn't get away alive. Swallowing my fears, I stubbornly made my way to my assigned place. It is hard to describe in words that which we experienced during this half-hour in no man's land. Both sides were still exchanging fire, and bullets were humming angrily through the air. Nearing the position of the dead man's body, I saw that my comrades were already lying next to it. Now Uncle Vasya pulled a sheet out of his sleeve and covered the body. Andreev hoisted the body onto his back and quickly started to crawl back. Yershov remained lying where he was. I didn't know what else he might have been ordered to do, so I waited for his signal and listened to some moaning coming from somewhere nearby. Yershov wasn't moving. I started to wonder if he had been killed. But if he had been hit by a bullet, he would have moved. I thought to calm myself, continuing to wait for his signal. Suddenly, somewhere quite close to me, I heard a sound. Someone was crawling across the field. Tensely peering into the white shroud of snow, I was thinking what to do if a German showed up. My knife. Clenching it in my hand, I waited for the foe's appearance. A minute later, I saw the German. He was crawling on his hands and knees. A submachine gun was swinging from his neck. At first I thought that he might be making his way out to the wounded man who was moaning. However, he wasn't heading in the direction of the moans, but instead towards the spot where Yershov was lying. What if Uncle Vasya is really dead? The thought flashed through my mind. Then what? I didn't take the barrel of my submachine gun off the German. When he reached Yershov, he took him by the collar and started to drag him back to his own trenches. Yershov gave no sign of life. At this moment I didn't notice either the cold or the bullets as they whistled past. All my thoughts were concentrated on one thing, the straining, heavily breathing German who was dragging Yershov. Suddenly tracer rounds streaked over my head, and for a moment the moon emerged from behind the clouds and illuminated the ground. The German stopped and lay next to Yershov, sheltering his body from the bullets and the moonlight. As soon as the moon disappeared again behind a cloud, the German hoisted Uncle Vasya onto his back and began crawling again. I aimed my submachine gun at the German and was just about to fire, when suddenly I froze. Vasya's hand was moving. I saw a knife in it, which he placed against the throat of the enemy. I almost cried out in joy. Uncle Vasya instantly shoved the head of the fascist into the snow, and keeping the knife to his throat, with the other hand he removed the machine pistol from his neck and pointed him in our direction. The Nazi obeyed, knowing that the least sign of resistance would mean his death. In this fashion, Vasily Yershov rode back to our trench on the back of the German. I crawled in behind them. In the trench, the German stood up and wiped his sweaty face with his sleeve. He was a tall, husky lad with overgrown hair. He sullenly looked around him. The body of Nikolaev, traitor to the motherland, was sprawled on the bottom of the trench. Zina Stroyeva was standing over it. It was she who had spotted the turncoat fleeing to the Germans and had shot him. The severe winter days of the blockade. The glow of fires never died down over Leningrad. The soldiers and officers glared at the enemy's trenches with fierce bitterness. After the death of Lesha Ulyanov, I began to work as a pair with Zina. Once early in the morning we were observing the adversary's first line of trenches. Plumes of smoke rose from their bunkers, and we could hear the ring of an axe somewhere. Suddenly one of the Germans ran out into the trench to tend to some need. Stroyeva spotted the Nazi and fired, then turned her head and spat. When we returned to our bunker, Sergeant Andreev jokingly greeted us with the words, "Ach, you snipers didn't even take pity on a man who'd been sent out in this weather." The sergeant pulled a blue envelope out of the pocket of his short fur coat and flapped it in front of my nose. "For the killed fascist, thank you. So here's your reward." It was a letter from my wife. "Greetings, my dear. Yesterday I received your letter. You can't imagine how happy we were to learn that you are alive, healthy, and in good spirits. Don't worry about us. We're all alive and well. But our separation is hard on me. There are such questions in life, dear, that can't be resolved in letters. If you could only know how much I need to meet with you, if only for just an hour, there's an important matter we must discuss." I was lost in speculation. What could have happened? I stretched out on my plank bed, and I don't recall if I dozed off or imagined it, but I could clearly see my wife's face. She was standing over Volodya's bed. Her chestnut-colored hair cascaded down around her pale neck. My wife was saying something to our son. Her large, dark blue eyes were laughing. Volodya, stretching out both of his little arms, was babbling something. I lay there, holding my breath, afraid to move. What could have happened with them? Senior Lieutenant Kruglov walked up to me. Looking at me closely, he asked, "What's the news from Leningrad?" I handed my commander the letter. Its contents, of course, reminded him of his own family, which remained in Leningrad. However, he kept his own feelings concealed. Returning the letter to me, he quietly said, "Yes, it is hard for them without us." Then he stretched out on a plank couch and folded his arms under his head. His thick eyebrows were twitching. At times his forehead wrinkled in concentration before relaxing again. I had seen this many times before. It was a sign of deep worry. A runner entered the bunker and handed Senior Lieutenant Kruglov a letter addressed to the deceased Ulyanov. The commander opened it and read the letter out loud. "Greetings, my precious son Alushenka. Yesterday I received your long-awaited message. I can't express my joy. My son, write me more often and don't forget Nadenka. The poor girl is waiting for you and is very worried. Alushenka, you're my dear. I pray for you every day and believe that you will return. Don't worry about me. I have everything I need except for you here beside me. Write, my son, as soon as you drive this fascist scum from our land. Greet your comrades for me, my son. I'm praying for them too, so that enemy bullets will always miss them. A deep bow from Uncle Prokhor and Aunt Anastasia. Nadenka herself will write you about everyone. Farewell, my dear. I am tightly hugging you." Mama 3. November 1941. Kruglov bowed his head. We were also silent. Uncle Vasya, tossing and turning, was coughing on the upper bunk. Andreev quickly walked over to the stacked guns, grabbed his machine gun, and stepped out into the trench. Zina was sitting next to the burning stove, her lips tightly compressed. Now and then she wiped her eyes. The company commander quietly lit a cigarette, neatly folded the letter, and stuck it into the breast pocket of his combat blouse. "Viktor Vladimirovich," Zina spoke up, "don't write Lesha's mother now. Wait a little bit." Kruglov started to reply, "It'll have to wait. Why, it's—" His voice trailed off as he left the bunker. Soon I received a pass for a 3-day leave in Leningrad. My joy was boundless. 3 whole days with my family. 3 days, 3 years, 3 centuries. It was 4 o'clock in the morning. I reached the fork in the road from Leningrad, one leading to Strelna and the other to Ligovo. I looked around. Behind me, over the front lines, flares were going up. In front of me lay a straight paved road, covered with a thin icy crust. Little wisps of snow were writhing and twisting across it. I step out alone onto the road. For some reason I recalled this childhood verse. I travelled the 8 kilometres in an hour. I stopped on Prospect Stachek to rest a bit. The war had changed everything around. The facades of buildings were peppered with shell and bomb fragments. Instead of windows, yawning black cavities looked out onto the snow-covered streets. A long, tightly packed line of people stretched along a wall on Narva Prospect. Spotting me, my face totally reddened by the frosty air and my rapid gait, the people turned their pale faces in my direction for a second. But only for a second, and then the heads turned back again, and the gazes of the famished eyes returned to the shop door. Many were sitting, hunkered over with their hands between their knees. They seemed dead. A brief German barrage fell, but no one headed for a shelter. The people were patiently waiting for the bakery to open in order to obtain their blockade ration of bread. Fatigue and sleep were overcoming people. Some of them sat down on the frozen ground by the wall in order to rest a bit and died on the spot. At the corner of Razezhaya and Ligovka streets, an enormous 5-story building was burning. Nobody was trying to save their belongings. People were standing outside the building, stretching their hands towards the fire, and using the heat to warm their backs and sides. 2 women along Narkimson Prospect were labouring to pull sleds, which were bearing tightly shrouded corpses. A group of Red Army soldiers was moving towards the front. One could hear shells constantly exploding. I approached the street where my family lived. My heart was pounding. Here was Mikhailov Street and my apartment building. I ran up to the third floor and stopped before the door of my apartment, not daring to knock. The children are probably sleeping, I thought. All the same, I cautiously knocked on the door and began to listen. It was quiet. I knocked again, this time more strongly, but nobody came to the door. I took a seat on a staircase step and lit up a cigarette. My hands were shaking. Fear was crawling up my spine. Where are they? Why didn't anyone answer the door? What might have happened over the 4 days since I had received Vera's last letter? Suddenly I heard footsteps on the staircase. I rushed down the stairs. It was Katya Pashkova, our building's janitor. She had changed so much it was hard to recognize her. "Aunt Katie, where are my wife and children?" She didn't answer, but quietly embraced me. Without looking me in the eye, she finally said, "Vera Mikhailovna left home day before yesterday and she hasn't returned." "Where did she go? Were they evacuated?" "No, she left without her things, together with her older boy, but where they went, I don't know." Barely moving her feet, Aunt Katya descended the staircase, not responding to my further inquiries. I stopped outside in the middle of the yard. Where to go? Where to look for them? It was an early morning hour. I started to wander the empty streets of the city. Patrols kept stopping me to check my papers, and then I walked further without any particular destination in mind. I reached Kondratev Prospect. An air raid warning started up. The sirens howled piercingly, joined by alarm whistles from factories and locomotives. In the sky, one could hear the heart-rending hum of enemy aircraft engines. Our anti-aircraft artillery opened fire. Shell bursts appeared in the night sky. For some reason, only now did a thought occur to me. I should ask the residents of our building whether they knew anything about my wife. Returning to my building, I began to ask neighbours where my wife went. No one knew anything. Perhaps she got caught in a barrage and was wounded, I thought. I visited all the hospitals. No, she was nowhere to be found. Not far from our building, on Nizhgorodskaya Street, I saw people gathered in front of a shattered building. Here, I was destined to experience the strongest grief in my life. The people were watching as recovery teams dug the dead out of the rubble. One elderly woman recognized her daughter among the dead. They led the stunned, grieving mother away. Several hours of waiting paced on. Nizhgorodskaya Street. 2 young women emerged from the ruins with the mutilated body of a child on a stretcher. I immediately recognized my 7-year-old son Vitya. I took my son into my arms and pressed my ear against his chest, but my fragile shred of hope was in vain. He was dead. Without releasing my dead son, I took a seat on the street curb. How long I sat there, an hour or 2 or days, I don't recall. Passers-by gathered around me. They were saying something, women were crying, and some were arguing with the police that were there. I didn't pay them any attention. I sat there, my head lowered, tightly clutching my child in my embrace. I was afraid to lift my eyes, knowing that I might see them carry out my dead wife. Someone touched my shoulder. It was a policeman. He asked me to take my son's body to a nearby truck. Here, beside the truck, I saw the mother of my children, Vera Mikhailovna, lying on a stretcher on the ground. She was also dead. I dropped to my knees in front of her and laid Vitya beside her. Then I picked up first my wife, next my son, pressing each one to my chest, kissing their dead faces. Then I laid them back down, side by side, not really understanding what I was doing. Aid workers took my wife and put her on the truck together with my son. The next morning I buried them together in one grave in the Bogoslovsky cemetery. I sat for a long time by the fresh gravesite. While I was there, trucks transporting the bodies of Leningraders kept pulling up to the woodshed by the gates of the cemetery. I dragged myself over to the shed, into which they were carrying the mutilated bodies of adults and children, searching for my infant, my son Volodya, among them. Not finding him, I again returned to the gravesite. Somewhere in the city, shell explosions were audible, aircraft motors hummed in the sky, and little snowflakes whirled in the air, as if fearing to fall on a ground so soaked with human blood. I couldn't stop thinking of my second son, Volodya. Where was he? How could I find him? I decided to head back to my apartment and begin my search there. Another air raid alarm caught me on my way back. I stepped under the archway of a building and wanted to stay outside, but two young female civilian patrol workers persistently demanded that I go to a shelter. Cribs and baby carriages stood in the spacious air raid shelter, which was lit by a kerosene lamp. The small children were sleeping. Those a bit older were playing hide-and-seek. The adults were sitting quietly, their heads bowed. One of the girls went up to her mother and began to tug on her sleeve. "Mama, I want something to eat. Give me a piece of bread. Give me." The mother caressed her daughter's head. "No, my precious daughter, we have no breed." The girl buried her face into her mother's lap, her thin little shoulders convulsively shaking. The mother, bitting her bluish lips, caressed the child's blonde head with a withered, lifeless hand. I took my knapsack off my back and pulled some bread and a chunk of dried meat out of it. I cut off a piece of the stale bread, laid a slice of meat on it, and handed it to the girl. The other children stopped playing and looked at me silently and expectantly. Like a machine, I cut slices of bread and meat. I gave them to the children, continuing to think of Volodya. An old woman walked up to me. "Dear comrade, don't feed us with your own ration. Keep it for yourself. You must fight." The air raid sirens stopped. Aunt Katya greeted me in our building's courtyard. My appearance must have been terrible. I hadn't closed my eyes for the last 48 hours, and I had forgotten entirely about food. The janitor didn't ask me about anything. She already knew everything. She silently took me by the hand and led me up to her room like I was a blind person. There I heard her say, "Forgive me, an old fool, for not saying anything upon meeting you downstairs. We're all living for the moment now. He's alive. Your son Volodya is alive. I have him." I rushed over to the crib, standing in the corner, and saw my sleeping son. Alive. Unharmed. My son. My heart. My heart was overflowing with happiness, and I kissed the emaciated, wrinkled hands of Aunt Katya. We cautiously went to the common kitchen and closed the door behind us. This kind, simple Russian woman, holding me by the hand like I was a child, tried to comfort me. "You mustn't despair, Yosif Yosifovich. You have a son, and you must take care of him." I took my knapsack off my back, pulled the remnants of my rations out of it and spread them out on the table. As soon as I took a seat on a sofa, however, I fell fast asleep, and I didn't hear Katya approach me, lay me down on it, remove my boots, and cover me with a blanket. When I woke up, it was already 7 o'clock in the morning. There was no one else in the kitchen. I quietly opened the door to Katya's room and glanced in on the sleeping Volodya. After a short time had passed, Katya returned. She was carrying 2 buckets of water from the Neva. Little pieces of ice were floating around in it. Aunt Katya sat down on a stool. Her hands were trembling. She was winded and breathing heavily through an opened mouth. Silvery flecks of frost glistened on her eyebrows. Her head slowly nodded. She dozed for a few minutes. I was afraid to move, so as not to disturb her peace. Giving a jolt, just as if from a blow, Aunt Katya stood up with difficulty and headed over to the table where the bread was sitting. She tore off a little piece of the crust with her fingers, placed it in her mouth, and began to fire up the makeshift heater. When Volodya woke up, he didn't recognize me and reached for Aunt Katya. "What's wrong with you, Volodenka?" she said tenderly. "Don't you recognize your father? It's your papa. Papa has come." Volodya turned his head. Knitting his brows, he glanced at my face, but continued to cling tightly with both arms to the neck of the unfamiliar woman. The word papa soothed him. Apparently he had heard this word many times from his mother. Then at last Volodya was sitting on my lap and fingering my orders and medals. That evening I went to the district health department and obtained a referral for my son to an orphanage. When I started to say goodbye to Aunt Katya, she picked Volodya up into her arms, pressed him to her breast, and asked me to leave Volodya with her for a short time. "That's not possible, Aunt Katya, that's not possible." I left her the address of the orphanage and asked that she visit Volodya, time permitting. I opened the door of my apartment and stepped into it with my son, in order to say goodbye to my orphaned home. The rooms were dark and cold. I found a lamp, the base still had some kerosene, and lit it. Volodya toddled over to the play corner, where toys were lying on the rug. He began to move them from place to place, saying something and waving his little arms. Everything was in its place. A photograph of my wife and eldest son Vitya in a leather frame was standing on the chest of drawers. Only now, looking at the photo, did I feel the full depth of my grief.